Okay, welcome to your week 4 Eng 1500 lecture. This is a cool lecture. It is a lecture that's in two parts. So we're going to start with the why we write part. This is the first step in your communications journey for Eng 1500. So we're going to spend a fair bit of lecture content teaching you how to communicate. And obviously this is quite pointed for things like your assessments. And the first chunk of this is today. The second half of the lecture, we're going to do prototyping, very useful for your projects. These are quite distinct parts. I'm going to record them in one sitting. Feel free to consume this content however you like. Awesome. As we tend to do, we'll smash through a little bit of housekeeping first. I am not at 100% at the moment. I'm struggling with a few things. I will try not to cough into the mic, so if you see muting myself, that's because I'm going to cough. I'm not going to catch it every time. I apologize. I'll do my best, but yeah, occasionally I might be coughing into the mic. I also am going to be probably a bit flat today just because I'm struggling. But I'll do my best. Anyway, your workshops are starting to go really, really well. Obviously, the first couple of weeks, 1500, there's all sorts of teething issues and all sorts of jazz, but it's really cool to see that you've been settling into your workshops. I'm going to as many as I can, and you seem to be absolutely smashing it. It's been really, really cool to see how well people are starting to do in their workshops, and it just goes up from here. All right, this is going to be awesome. You do have competencies. Some of you started this week. Some of you will have it next week. These are meant to be learning opportunities for you, okay? So the competency isn't supposed to be something that you do easily. It's supposed to be the exact opposite of that. It's supposed to be, hey, this is a realistic scenario. Hey, maybe this is actually harder than you thought it was going to be. And, oh, look at all of these things that went wrong. Cool. They went wrong here, and we learnt a lot from them, all right? So the objective of the competency isn't to succeed. It's to learn as much as possible. I don't care if every single person fails their competency, as long as every single person can turn around from that and say, these are the things that I learned, and this is how I'm going to be better for test day as a result. That's their objective, okay? Plus, they get you to work in teams and all sorts of jazz. The assessment is up on Blackboard. Hopefully, if you've watched it, hopefully you've made a start at it before this lecture, because you will find this lecture a lot more useful if you have had a start at it. And if you haven't, maybe start it and maybe quickly rewatch at least the first half of the lecture. I want to try a few things this year that are different to how we did things last year. So the live session on Tuesday, I want to set the live part of that aside for going through Q&A about reports and me showing you things like that. So that's what the live, I'm hoping, will be. Something to do with report writing or formatting or whatever, and probably driven by you. Hey, Dylan, whenever I try and do blah, blah, blah in Word, it screws up. All right, I'll show you how to do that correctly. So if you have questions, if you've got parts of your report that aren't working or you don't know how to do them, save them up, figure out a good way to ask them as a question in the live stream, and do that. Something else I want to try this year, and this is totally experimental. I have no idea how it's going to go, but next Sunday, the 25th, 21st, it'll be the 21st. It's the day before your reports are due. I'm going to go live on YouTube. I'm going to ask beforehand people to email me copies of their assignment if they want me to go through them and critique them live on stream. So this is totally voluntary. You don't have to do it. And be aware, if you send it to me, you get selected, because I'm assuming many people will send it. If you send it and you get selected, I'm going to critique this to the best of my ability. So the objective of this session is for me to go through and go, this could have been done better, 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 all right? So I'm going to rip into these assignments, and as a result, you're going to get this laundry list of things going, cool. If I fix that in the way he said, my report will be better as a result. All right, so it's kind of like assignment feedback, except it's before it's due so that you can actually implement it to get a better mark, okay? And hopefully the reports that I go through, the information in that will be indicative. It's easy for them to put it down, go, I was up to page whatever, or jump back to something on page 12 when they're on page 37. It helps. So you do that. You also do double space text. If you don't know how to do double space text, ask me in the live stream and I will show you. But it's generally there to help the markers. It spaces your text out and puts basically a blank line in between each of your lines of text, so I can write in it and make notes and stuff like that. We did cover this one. You should always explain your acronyms before you use them. So like this, a horizontal axis wind turbine, HORT, is a common blah, blah, blah. And then you can use the acronym from that point onwards, but you've always got to introduce it first. The other thing that you should not do, ever, is take a photo of a computer screen. Okay? For any reason, you should never take a photo of a computer screen. It's just a horrible thing for a user to have to look at. Take a screenshot if you need to. But even more than that, you should generally not be putting in big dumps of code. It's very difficult to read code. What you should be doing instead when you want to explain something, instead of just showing them code, is show them things like UML diagrams, flowcharts of this is the logic of the code, or pseudocode. If you are coding and you look at your assessment, there is an example of pseudocode in it so that you will know what's going on there. Cool. You can put little snippets of code in, and particularly if you want to explain things like syntax, it makes sense to have a line of code. But don't just go, here's what we did this week. Boom. 4 photos of pages of text on the screen. Terrible. Couple of bonuses. Again, you don't really need to memorize any of this stuff, and we'll go over it again, but these are just common things that I see people do, and I'd like you to break the habit as early as possible. Never put text beside a figure, okay? So this bottom image, that is wrong. Never do that. Do what's up the top. Even if the figure, you don't want it to be that big, and you shrink it down and there's white space either side, that's totally fine. Never put text beside a figure. It's terrible. You can make multi-part figures, so if you've got a bunch of figures that you want to put together, by all means, put them together, and then figure 1 with 3 parts. Using PowerPoint to put a few figures together and save the slide as an image is a great way to do that. You should have a caption to all of your figures, and the way that you do that is you right-click on the figure and you go Insert Caption.